Okay, so mannerism is this breakdown of the harmony and proportion and sort of organic unity of the Renaissance that artists probably arrived at by reacting against the perfection of their forefathers, trying to innovate within that, but also from a certain artificiality that comes from studying the works of Michelangelo and Raphael instead of studying nature itself. It makes works more artificial. So here is the moment in the Bible, in the book of Acts, when Saul of Tarsus, who was a persecutor of Christians, was on the road to Damascus and was struck blind by God and converted to become St. Paul, who turned around and wrote half of the New Testament, right? Half of the Christian Bible is written by St. Paul. From this moment of conversion. And the way Tintoretto translates that section of the Bible is he shows God in the upper left corner, kind of streaming in of Saul, yet, at this point in his life, right in the foreground and the center, and all this tumult around him, right? Just chaos everywhere, which is not mentioned anywhere in the Bible. And all of the figures, the ground has been sort of tipped up so we can see this multitude of figures, and it becomes this mannerist, confusing jumble of figures, right? As things move away everywhere, we can make out Paul pretty clearly because he leaves open space around it, but then we look at that group on the left, and it's just this crazy jumble of figures, the horse diving into the water on the right. What the heck is going on with that archway behind the bridge and the guy pushing horses up the bridge, right? It's just full of sort of confusing detail, right? That gets us away from the story at hand. And I've got a couple of details, right? The guy, and look at the colors as well, right? These pinks and yellows and blues that are jarring, decorative and artificial. These are all mannerist themes. The jumble of figures. The guy holding his head as his horse is rearing doesn't feel like there's any room for his other leg. It's almost like he forgot the leg that's going behind the horse on the other side of the saddle, right? It's almost like a one-legged man riding the horse because we don't even see it down below. But then that hot pink and green, the barefoot figure running behind him, the bright oranges, right? The lemon yellow of the figure on horseback. Behind him again, this confusing jumble of figures in really bright decorative colors, and crowded into a space that doesn't seem to allow them enough room to do what they're supposed to be doing. Jumps in space, right? So there's foreground, background, and there's a chasm between the two. And again, things left undefined for us. Why is this here? Especially because the Bible doesn't mention anything about chaos. It just mentions him falling off his horse. Right? It doesn't say anything about sound. It doesn't say anything about reverberations or anything like that, right? So this is mannerism in a nutshell, right? And this was the dominant art throughout Italy, at least, and really Europe as a whole. So we talked about how King Francis I adopted this style for his decorations of his palace, right? This was the dominant style from the 1520s on in the 16th century, so the later half of the 16th century. Mannerism is everywhere. Now, they don't call it mannerism, right? We call it mannerism. They thought of it as late Renaissance, right? Renaissance art. This is the dominant theme. Now, one of the things that we talked about when we looked at mannerism was the degree to which this chaotic, imbalanced style coincided with a certain degree of chaos in the social structure of Europe, right? Beginning with the Protestant Reformation, but also coinciding with the death of Raphael, the death of Leonardo, the aftermath of all of that. But in particular, the idea that European society doesn't have the same sort of cohesive unity as it did during the Renaissance, when the church was all powerful, when no one questioned authority. And when Martin Luther begins the Protestant Reformation in 1517, he questions the primary authority in Europe. The church was stronger than any given king, right? Or any leader anywhere. The papacy was the central power structure in Europe. And Luther questioned that. And the church did nothing. Right? And imagine that. For 25 years, the church did nothing. They kind of just ignored him and hoped he would go away. Right? And hoped this whole Protestant thing would just sort of burn itself out. You know? And that's, of course, not what happened. Right? Protestantism took hold. And throughout Europe, we find it on the rise. And at the same time that we find it on the rise, we start to see other authoritative structures also be questioned in the wake of what Martin Luther did. So we find, for example, many parts of Europe were still governed by the old feudal structure, right? We've been looking at it a lot in Italy, where merchants can make their own future. But a lot of Europe still had feudal lords, people who were bound to their land, working for the profit of the landowner, right? We find in the 1520s a number of peasant uprisings against their feudal lords, riots, right? We also find in the aftermath of Luther other kinds of religious uproar. For example, people going into churches and destroying works of art, iconoclasm, because the second commandment says you shouldn't make images. So we find that even though these are images of Jesus, they will whitewash them, or if they're statues, tear them off the wall. And it's been estimated, particularly in Northern Europe, where Protestantism was strong, that we've lost a good 85 or 90% of the works of art that existed at the time because of iconoclasm. So the kind of tumult, the kind of busy, chaotic nature that we see in Mannerist art coincides with a chaos in society. Is it a cause and effect thing? No. It's an interesting parallel. Okay? Now, as I mentioned, the church did nothing to counteract this questioning of its authority for about 25 years. But in 1543, the Catholic Church decided to convene a church council to address what's going on. Okay? To address the issues that Martin Luther had actually raised. I don't think they mentioned him so much by name, but they decide, you know what, maybe people seem to be suggesting that we need some sense of reform. Right? And so they gather theologians, church leaders together in the city of Trent in 1543 to begin thinking about reforming from within. Unlike Martin Luther, who had protested and just broke away, right? They want to, okay, fine, we get it, we've done some things wrong, this whole indulgence thing, maybe not so good, right? All of the wealth and the secularism of the church, maybe not so good, right? How can we address those criticisms? What can we change from within to make it work, right? To improve our status. Okay? So the Council of Trent was a series of meetings, right, amongst church leaders to hammer out issues on how the church should reform itself from within. And they met in three major ecumenical councils, right? Three major gatherings that took place over 20 years. So the first one was in 1543, the last one was in 1563. I don't think it was every 10 years, right? I don't remember where number 2 was. But there were 3 meetings, right, in Trent. And this began what's known as the Counter-Reformation, right? This is the church's reform contrary to Luther's, right? This is their rebuttal. Again, without mentioning him by name. Okay? We're going to reform from within. For us in an art history class, right, the Counter-Reformation is extraordinarily important because at the third council, at the third meeting in 1563, they decided to address the issue of art. Since we had these iconoclastic controversies coming up, right? We had Protestants destroying art. The Catholics are looking at what the Protestants are doing and how can we reform from within, and what do we want to hold on to, and what do we want to change. Right? Because that's part of the reform movement, is say, nope, this is important, we're not changing that. Right? And when they get around to art in 1563, at the last council, they decide that unlike the Protestants who are tearing crucifixes off the wall, right, destroying statues, whitewashing frescoes, right, burning paintings, unlike them, we, the Catholic Church, they determine it, we think art is important. We think art is an important part of Christian life, regardless of what that pesky second commandment says about making no images, right? And the justification that they gave goes back to the Middle Ages, right? Around the year 700, Pope Gregory the Great, around the year 700, was faced with kind of the same issue. There was a group of people in North Africa who he had heard were destroying images. And he wrote them a letter. Don't do it. This is dumb. Right? You're doing dishonor to the people represented in the image. Because if you think about it, the point of the second commandment is that you shouldn't make things like God makes things. Right? God creates. But if you take a crucifix and you knock off the head of Jesus because you think it's a bad sculpture, aren't you doing a disservice to Jesus by doing that? Right? That's kind of the argument. And what Gregory said around the year 698, I think is the year of this epistle, was that, one, you do this disservice. But two, art is really important because most people can't read. But all people can see. Not all people, but you get the right? And that images can teach. Images can instruct. Images are, in the words of Pope Gregory, the Bible of the illiterate. Images can reach an audience that words cannot. Right? And at the Council of Trent, they adopt that idea. Right? That medieval idea about the importance of images for instructing the body. Right? The body of the church. That they can reach out to people who do not read. Part of that is control. Right? Protestants were all about personal interpretations of the Bible. Right? So part of it is that, but part of it is also being able to reach more people. And this comes at a time, right, when the Mass was performed almost exclusively in Latin, rather than in the vernacular, rather than in French or Italian, or Spanish. So there are these words coming at people, both written and verbal, that they simply can't understand. But images you can get. The problem for them then lay is, what were images doing in 1563? They were mannerist. They were confusing. They were jumbled. They were chaotic. They were primarily decorative in colors and compositions. They were weird. So they decided to come up with a series of precepts for how art should look that are meant to apply almost exclusively to religious art. Right? They're not worried about portraits. Right? They're not worried about genre scenes of everyday life. They're worried about religious images. And the Council of Trent determines that art has a purpose in the church, and that purpose is teaching. That purpose is the edification and instruction of the flock, right? Of the congregation. And so they come up with 3 basic rules that religious art needs to follow. And as we look at these rules, we understand that these rules are a direct rebuttal of mannerism, or at least the dominant trends of painting in the later part of the 16th century, particularly in Italy. It should be clear and simple, and you should have no trouble understanding what it depicts. immediately intelligible. Very simple. That's precept number 1 that the Council of Trent lays down. Precept number 2, it should be realistic and accurate. The detail should help us to understand the picture by being accurate to the scene depicted. Okay. The third precept, it should make the viewer feel pious. It should inspire you to think religious thoughts. And the best way to do it, they recommend, is to appeal to the emotions of the viewer, to inspire religious piety. These are the 3 things that art needs to do in order to effectively teach church doctrine. Right? This is laid down in 1563. Guess what? Artists respond. And what we start to see at the very end of the 16th century, moving into the 17th century, into the 1600s, is an art that becomes more clear and simple, more realistic, that is much more emotionally charged. Right? So let's look at the same scene by a counter-Reformation artist, right? Somebody who's affected by this. Here's Caravaggio, maybe the best example of artist's response to the counter-Reformation precepts on how to draw. This is the exact same scene we see with Timothy. Right? This is where now, right, Saul is being converted into St. Paul. Why they give it the different titles of his name is anybody's guess. That's what the National Gallery calls that. That's what I think it's in the Vatican calls that. Right? But it's the same scene. He's knocked off his horse, that much the Bible tells us, by the blinding light of God. Right? As the story goes later, right, he's led blind to the city of Damascus where he's healed. And on his healing, he changes his name from Saul to Paul, and becomes the great apostle and leader of the church in the aftermath of Jesus. Right? So, what has Caravaggio done? Right? What are our 3 precepts? Simple. Right? Immediately intelligible. Yeah, we're there, right? He's gotten rid of all the extraneous details. There's nothing confusing, there's nothing to distract you from the central scene of Paul falling off of his horse. Right? How does he achieve that simplicity? 2 things that are crucial here, I think, that have ramifications for the other things the church wanted. 1, the lighting is nothing like anything we've seen anywhere else. Leonardo liked his darkness, but his darkness was this sort of cloudiness, this mistiness, right? This fumata. This is theater lighting. This is lit like a stage prop. Right? It's kind of almost an artificial lighting in a way, where the light hits the figures he wants us to look at and obscures the figures that don't make any difference, like the landscape background, for example. Right? That would distract us. Let's get right to it. Okay? Light on him, and it becomes the light of God, that theatrical light, right? That becomes deity shining on Paul, hitting his horse, hitting Paul, hitting the groom that's trying to restrain the horse to keep it from stepping on Paul. Right? So, it's simple, right? It's direct, right? It's realistic. Look at the realism of the scene. Look at how Paul is almost coming into our space. Like, he's so real, he's not just realistically drawn, he's part of your real environment. It almost looks like those hands are coming out of the picture toward us. Right? There's almost a seamless integration of the real world and the painted world. Right? So it achieves that as well. That proximity of Paul, that simplification, the paring down of the details, focuses our attention on this dramatic moment of Paul's conversion. That is emotionally charged, right? Filmmakers do this. When they want you to become emotionally engaged with the scene, they give you a close-up, and that gets you emotionally involved, right? When they want you to think about, our place in the greater scheme of things, they'll draw the camera back. because you don't have that same engagement, right? If I gave my entire lecture right in the face, right, it becomes much more engaging than if I'm all the way back here, right? That's why I used to sit in the back too, right? Because I didn't want to have them right in my face, right? I think I can do the good work back here. But close-ups do that, right? They get you engaged empathically, empathetically with the image, and Caravaggio does that as well. Right? So he's really, we think, responding to what the Counter-Reformation had said about how images should look. And this new style that we're talking about, this response to the Counter-Reformation, this highly dramatic, realistic, emotional, yet at the same time harmonious and simplified. Right? We as historians refer to this as the Baroque period. Now, ideally, it should only define works like this, but it has come to be applied to basically the 17th century. Even though it begins earlier, because things don't change in 1600, right? Caravaggio begins painting in the early 1590s, right? So the response begins to sort of take hold last couple decades of the 16th century, 1570s, 80s, 90s, and by 1600 it really becomes full fruition, right? Yeah.
I have a question. I thought when people said Baroque, it meant kind of over the top.
And it gets there. Yeah, that's a very good point, Gabrielle. That the term, when we talk about Baroque now, we think of things like a Bach symphony, right, or opera, which is born by during this period. Early on, the response is much more direct, like Caravaggio. Later on, what we find is the things that are starting here, theatricality, emotionalism, that those things start to get sort of stronger and stronger, and that by the middle end of the 17th century, Baroque has become sort of more elaborate, right? And so we'll trace that after spring break, we'll see how that happens. Right? But you're absolutely right that way. The term Baroque actually comes from a term that was used by people, jewelers, to define a particular kind of pearl that would take on an odd shape, sort of different from the perfect round circles of pearls are supposed to be. A Baroque pearl was one that was sort of nebulous, clumpy, right? Still attractive in its own way, but different from that, and a little bit more complex, right? So the term comes from that because in many ways you would not really necessarily confuse a Baroque picture with a Renaissance picture, because it doesn't have that sense of geometry underneath it, stability, and timelessness that we would see in a Leonardo or Raphael or Michelangelo, right? It's got a little bit more sort of temporality. In other words, it's a moment in time, right? A lot more movement, a lot more action, but not to the point of sort of blowing us out of, making us wonder what the hell we're looking at. Sorry, what the heck we're looking at, right? So the Baroque is very much a response to what was going on in Mannerist art, and inspired very much by what theologians were saying that they wanted from works of art. Right? So I've got some details. Just quickly look at these to talk about the realism, to talk about what Caravaggio is doing here. Right? The proximity of St. Paul to us makes us sympathetic to him. Right? It makes us empathic to his reaction. That the whole point is that you should think about your own life, what you've been doing, and do you want the light of God to fall on you and strike you blind so you end up doing the right thing, or you just want to go ahead and do it, right? And the realism here, and we'll look at other details as well. Look at the light shining through his thumb, right? The light of God is so strong because, like, when you're a kid, you would put a flashlight in your mouth, and you would see it through your cheek. That sort of idea that your skin is in fact translucent when exposed to bright light. Extraordinary details that way, but also putting him where his head seems almost like it's spilling right out of the frame. The groom that's holding the horse is a figure that appears in a lot of Caravaggio images. But look at how the difference between Paul's features in the foreground and the skin quality of the groom. This is a man who spends his life outside, and he's ruddy, right? He's tanned, his skin is scaly and hard. And Caravaggio catches that, right? in addition to things like the haunch of the horse with the veins, right? It's extraordinarily realistic, which is engaging, right? It brings you into the image. Right down to things that are typical Caravaggio tricks. He loves dirty-feeted figures. He likes rooting this image in the time period. What would the groom of the horse of St. Paul have been doing? He wouldn't have been nicely dressed, right? Think about the 12 apostles. Who were these guys, right? Walking around with Jesus for 3 years, right? A lot of them were fishermen. What would they have looked like? Right? Realistic and accurate. This is one of the things that the Counter-Reformation wanted. And Caravaggio nails this, right? So he hits on a new style of painting that is very much in response to what the Counter-Reformation was asking for. And it's at the time that Caravaggio begins to do it, 1590s, right around 1600, it's nearly unique, right? Nobody else is painting exactly like this at the time. And he had no pupils, so far as we know, although there's a new painting somebody found in their attic. Somebody found a Caravaggio in their attic, like 2 years ago. They just had a big convention over whether or not it's really a Caravaggio, right? It looks pretty good, mostly, right? But it may have been touched up by somebody else. Did he have pupils? We don't have any on record. He's kind of a loner that way. But he hits on this new style of painting, right? That's so extraordinarily realistic we now call Baroque. One of his more famous works is a painting. These are all altar pieces for Catholic churches in Rome. This is the moment when Christ appears to St. Matthew to call him from his profession, which was a money changer, he was a banker. Right? Call him away from that profession, give up your wealth, right? Give up your affluence, come be a follower of me. And Christ is off to the right. Matthew is not the first disciple that he asks to follow him. Right? The first ones were Peter and Andrew, who were fishermen. So we think that's probably St. Andrew with him on the right. And Christ has come in, and again, the light of God, that theatrical, dramatic lighting that comes in as Jesus comes in from above. We never see the light source of this, right? But it simplifies the scene, it directs your attention, it focuses the viewer on the elements that Caravaggio wants you to pay attention to. And it removes extraneous details so that we see this human emotional interaction. Right? Jesus has come in, he points to St. Matthew. St. Matthew's sitting at a table with a bunch of his group, they're counting money. Right? Matthew's in the center with a red beard, got 3 young boys and an old man with him. Those figures are in stages of recognition to what's happening in the scene. Right? The kid in the foreground leans over, sees what's happening. The kid behind him also sees, but Matthew's the one who gets it. Right? Matthew sees and understands. The old man on the left and the young boy with the red sleeves, they don't get it at all. Right? It's about human interactions. You'll notice in both of these that Caravaggio's lighting, right, that dramatic theatrical lighting, also simplifies the color scheme. It's not just simplified in the overall composition of figures and paring down the numbers that we need to tell the story to the sort of bare essentials. Beyond that, it also pairs on the colors. So Caravaggio colors are these sort of earth tones. Browns and yellows and oranges, highlighted sometimes with yellows, maybe a shot of a muted green here or there, maybe sometimes we'll see a purple or a blue. But on the norm, it's dominated by these earth tones, these dirty earth tones. Right? That's his style. And again, with the Calling of St. Matthew, we have that same interest in extraordinary realism, right? There's Jesus, and we think St. Andrew. Notice the difference between the two of them, the same sort of difference we saw with the conversion of St. Paul, where Christ's skin looks one way, Andrew the fisherman's skin looks another way. Christ's hair pretty much obscured in the darkness. But look at Andrew's hair. It's matted, right? It's dirty. You can almost feel the salt from the sea having sort of hardened this hair. And then this wonderful detail. Christ is calling with this gesture, right, to Matthew. And Andrew, the disciple, the follower, who's learning it, is saying, oh, I get it, right? I'm going to give you kind of the same gesture to show that he's the follower of Christ. And then you get the third gesture from Matthew. He's going, you mean me? Right? So it's told through these human gestures. This realism for Caravaggio is really immediate. In the Renaissance, artists made drawings on the canvas before they started painting. That was the norm, right? Study it through. Caravaggio worked more immediate, almost like an impressionist. He started doing things, right, on it. And he claimed that his realism was so unique, was so extraordinary that he never had to study another artist. That nobody ever influenced him. That said, we've seen that hand before. Where have we seen that hand before? Look at Jesus' hand. The Sistine Chapel, right? Well, guess what? Caravaggio's first name is Michelangelo. Michelangelo Merici de Caravaggio, right? And yeah, there he is, right? That exact same gesture in reverse. So you probably saw a print or used a print of it. Remember what we just talked about when we looked at the final? Christ is the new Adam. So it's not just because he's paying homage to Michelangelo or something, right? He has some meaning in adopting this figure, in adopting that hand, that Christ has now come to correct the sin that Adam was. So Caravaggio has established for us an extraordinary new way of painting, right? That becomes the basis for what we call the Baroque, right? And it's based entirely on what the Counter-Reformation wanted from art as a teaching tool, right? So we'll pick up Baroque art, look at a few more Italian things, get to Gabrielle's question about when it becomes overblown, right? And then move to see how it spreads through the rest of Europe from there. Okay? Have a good break, and we'll see you on the 18th.